Welcome back to the Clear Admit MBA Admissions Podcast. I'm your host, Graham Richmond, and today we are going to talk about applying to business school and making a plan for the long term. So this podcast is really directed at people who are applying, let's say, more than 18 months from now. So people who are kind of a couple years out. What are the things they can do? And I've invited Alex Brown, my kind of co-host on this podcast, to talk about that. We have basically a 7-step to-do list that'll help you if you're planning to apply to business school down the road. Before we kind of jump into that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about this podcast and just to thank you for listening and to let you know that, we've been having a blast doing this, and several of the podcasts that we've run out there have just received kind of overwhelming support. We really have been pleasantly surprised. I've been kind of keeping some stats on this, and I just thought I would share that a couple of the most popular episodes are the one that we did with Chad Losey, who's the admissions director at Harvard Business School. There's another one that we did quite recently, which is already a kind of top 5 podcast for us, and that's the one we did with Keith Bevins of Bain & Company, where he talked about recruiting and getting a job in strategy consulting. We've also done other episodes with MIT's Director of Admissions, Donna Levinson, and Luke Anthony Pena over at Tuck. We had a great episode about kind of GMAT versus GRE. There's just been lots and lots of episodes that have gotten a really terrific response. So we thank everyone for listening. Keep tuning in. And I think today's going to be really useful. And Alex, I wanted to welcome you on board here. I think the impetus for this episode actually came from some audience feedback, right?
Yeah, that's right. And thank you very much for having me again, Graham. It was actually a request on Reddit for a candidate, or a candidate thinking well ahead, wanting some advice on sort of what he or she should do at this stage 2 years out of applying.
Yeah, and it was a good point. I mean, we do have kind of I think there was like a 12-step program for people like, starting now, applying this coming fall type thing that we did in the past on this podcast, but we've never done a like real long range planning. And so I think this should be useful. And I will say to those on Reddit and elsewhere who kind of requested this, please come on to iTunes or wherever you go to listen to podcasts and leave a review or a rating. We'd greatly appreciate it. So let's dive in. So we said there are kind of 7 steps that people might want to take as they kind of map out their long-range plan to apply to business school. The first one, Alex, is, I guess we could kind of classify it as an academic-related task, right? It's sort of testing, so GMAT or GRE, and also you had talked to me a little bit about like supplemental coursework. So maybe can you walk us through this first step? What should be people thinking about in this first step?
Sure. As everyone knows, I guess, that's considering applying to top business schools, that they're going to be required to take a standardized test, the GMAT, or possibly the GRE, which is, I guess, becoming more acceptable in business school admissions. Test scores generally last for 5 years. So schools will take a test score that's been undertaken within the last 5 years. And if you have the time now, a couple of years out of applying, and you haven't already taken the test, it's good to try to get this hurdle out of the way before you're in the midst of writing essays and various other things, getting very close up to the deadline. So I think the first tip, or the key point to the first tip, is to try to get the standardized tests taken care of early. It will require lots of preparation. So this isn't the case of getting it out of the way, just go on and take the test and so forth. All your peers, all your fellow potential classmates will be preparing thoroughly before they take either the GMAT or the GRE. So you need to do the same, but you can do that now, again, rather than waiting till sort of 6 months or 3 months before you're planning to apply. So that's the test side of it, Graham.
Yeah, and I would say, just to add to that, I think, it for a lot of people, juggling the test and the stress of, taking a timed exam and trying to achieve a high score for, which is really what many of the top schools look for, the stress of that doesn't really mesh well with kind of preparing essays and getting your recommendation letters together, or coaching your recommenders, getting everything together for an MBA application. And so I think Alex's point here is like, get it out of the way. Obviously do the preparation, that you need to do for it, but get it out of the way, because you don't really want to be taking the test or worrying about your test score while you're doing everything else that you're going to eventually have to do to apply to business school.
Yeah, the one slight caveat to this strategy is if you do get the test taken early, which is great, if your score is below the average of the schools you're targeting, you absolutely must consider the retake. Because as an admissions officer, a role I served a number of years ago, if I'm looking at a slightly below average test score of a candidate that had time to retake, I might question this person's commitment to the process.
Yes, that was always my favorite, is the person who took the GMAT or GRE like 2 years before applying fell massively short of the average at Wharton where you and I worked, but at any school this would apply, and then applies to business school and is sort of scratching their head as to why they were waitlisted or rejected. It's sort of like, well, you had all this extra time to fix this issue. Why not at least try? I mean, because I think I know when I saw an application, if the candidate at least had taken it a second time and maybe they achieved the same score, at least they can then say, look, this is not a great strength of mine, but recognizing that, there's an average, I went back out there and tried to boost the score. It didn't work out for me, but I didn't want you to, feel disrespected in this process. I'm aware that I'm weak here and I've tried to address it, as opposed to the candidate just like, well, I'm going to just try to get in with a low score. And, even though schools actively say, take the test more than once if you need to, there's no penalty in doing so. So great point.
Yeah, the effort does count. So the second part of this sort of first tip is looking at your academics and identifying if there are any potential weak areas that you need to fix. And there are two broad buckets for this. One is if your overall undergraduate performance is less than the average, again, of admitted students, or I would say, 2 or 3 sort of point GPAs, points less, or however you would say that. Is there some room for what we would call transcript repair? So taking a class or two to show that this is no longer a weakness if it looked like a weakness in your undergrad. Similarly, if you have a liberal arts degree, so there's little evidence of sort of analytical subject matter in your undergrad, it might ease your transition to business school to take a couple of classes that are sort of more rigorous from an analytical standpoint. And this would sort of show, well, for one, it would help ease your transition to business school, but it would also show real good self-awareness and judgment on your part that you understand the weakness and that you've taken care of it.
Yeah, and I guess I'm going to share kind of a personal anecdote here. So I think I fell into both buckets when I applied to business school, in that I had a liberal arts background, had studied art history, and in liberal arts you take a lot of different types of classes, but I didn't have kind of a pre-business background, right? And my GPA wasn't great. It was certainly below the average at the top schools. And I was not self-aware. So I just applied to business school thinking, well, I went to a decent undergrad and whatever, I'm going to apply to business school. And I got that exact feedback, Alex, from, I guess, somebody who was a colleague of yours, Bob Alec at the school, kind of told me at Wharton, he said, you need to show us that you could actually make this transition from kind of liberal arts into a business degree. And also your GPA is not like at our average. And so building what he called an alternative transcript, was kind of his suggestion. And so I think when we think about classes, by the way, we see a lot of discussion on Livewire and just on our site in general about like, well, what do you do to build an alternative transcript? Can you just do like a certificate program, or should you take, kind of credit earning undergraduate courses? I tend to lean towards the latter, and I tend to lean towards courses like statistics, accounting 101, maybe calculus, in some cases like an econ class. But those are sort of what I would call kind of the building block type classes that can help you, as you say, transition into business school, but also demonstrate to the admissions team that you're ready to roll. And maybe if you're getting A's, that gee, this person's kind of an A student today, even though in college they were sort of a, B student.
No, I think that's precisely correct. And if I remember correctly, I think Bob Ailey probably also had a liberal arts background and an MBA from Wharton, so he understood the transition that he felt you needed to undergo.
Yeah, and just so that our listeners understand, I took that advice and I applied it, and reapplied to Wharton because I didn't get in anywhere the first time round, and Wharton admitted me, but that's that's kind of specific, but actually HBS admitted me too. So that advice that was given to me, I think is very broadly applicable to any kind of top business school. If you're looking to get in and your GPA is a little low, or you have no evidence of kind of foundational coursework in business, it's a great idea to build an alternative transcript. What do you think about kind of online? When I was doing this, I went to a kind of evening class once a week and got my grades, and but now things have changed. And so, Alex, what can people just do this online if they need to build this alternative transcript? And any ideas about how they would go about doing it or where they might look?
Yeah, I mean, I think business schools are becoming more open to online coursework. I think that's just the nature of sort of how technology's evolved and the maturation, as it were, of these types of courses that are delivered online. I don't think you want to take a course that's just pass-fail, i.e. you do some kind of work and get a credit for it. I think you need to take a course that gives you a grade, and you need to get A grades in these courses. Getting Bs in these types of courses is not going to support your case at the very top schools.
No.
So I would look around a little bit. The other thing that you can do is just ask an admissions officer. If you've got a certain coursework that you're planning to take, get some direct feedback from the adcoms in question. The reality now is you have the time to take some coursework. You have a couple of years, so that's very good for you. And you're not sort of stuck in this sort of applying 3 months from now and starting to realize I need to get this done also.
Yeah, if you're listening to this episode and you are planning to apply to business school a couple of years from now, you should be patting yourself on the back because you're prepared. You're going to be mega prepared, and that's why we're doing this episode. So that first tip is really all about building up your kind of academic capacity, making sure that the test is where it needs to be, that you take it, good score, etc., and building an alternative transcript as needed. The second tip, Alex, is about work experience. Do you want to walk us through what can people be doing in that domain?
Yeah, there's a couple of broad issues I wanted to address here, and obviously, Graham, you can then sort of embellish and sort of add to this. But first, wherever you are at work, I mean, business schools tend to take people from a variety of different types of work experience. So you shouldn't think, well, I have to be a consultant or I have to be a banker or someone in tech to then be ready to pursue my MBA. So I would say wherever you are, it's quite likely that you could prepare yourself well from a work experience standpoint for the admissions process. So one question we often get asked is, should I jump industries before the MBA to get a better chance? I would say that's risky and not that worthwhile. What I would say is a better use of your time is to go to your boss and ask to be assigned more rigorous projects, more rigorous sort of work assignments. If you get a chance to do an assignment overseas, for example, or to work with on a global team, if you're able to do that in your work environment. But in essence, be proactive about your work experience from now on and really push yourself to get into sort of maybe some unfamiliar territory. Maybe it feels a bit personally risky, but that's where you're really going to learn. And that's where some of your work stories for your application will evolve.
Yeah, that's a great point. I feel like we see a lot of candidates who are sort of, they want to constantly move from job to job. And I think, I feel like it was somebody at HBS once told me, when they see someone bouncing around, who hasn't spent at least a year in any given post, and ideally two, it sort of raises a bit of a red flag. So yeah, I wouldn't be sort of thinking about like how many jobs can I have before business school or something. I think staying put and building your leadership experience and skill set and seeking out those challenges is really important. And building also, we'll get into this later in another tip, but developing some relationships in the workplace can be quite fruitful when it comes to applying to business school down the road too. So that's good advice. So that's the second tip, is just really getting the most out of your work experience. This is not to say that you can't change jobs. I mean, if a fantastic opportunity comes along and you've been working for 2 years in consulting and a client says, hey, come on board, and you've got, another 18 months to 2 years to work with that client before you start, applying to business school, that could be fine too. But again, we're talking about experiences that are going to be deep and not, just sort of bouncing around. So Alex, what's our third? We actually are going to talk a little bit about what you should be doing when you're not working and not kind of studying for the GMAT or something, right?
Right, and this so the third bucket talks about outside of work activities, extracurricular activities, and so on and so forth. So when a candidate was in college, obviously they had an opportunity at that point to be involved outside of the classroom, to potentially take on a leadership role and so forth, and that's very good. If you were able to do that, more so I think for US college students based in the US, maybe so, but nevertheless, that really shows a positive sort of attribute about the candidate, and business schools really look at past behavior to determine your then involvement in their program and your future sort of leadership involvements outside of work. Going forward. So at this stage, 2 years out, what are you doing outside of work? What sort of activities are you involved in? What are you passionate about outside of work? And are you pursuing those passions? And how are you pursuing those passions? So schools want to admit people that are sort of multidimensional to the extent that they can. And they also want to admit people that take initiative, take on leadership, get involved, are fundamentally decent human beings. So maybe some volunteer work and so on and so forth. So to the extent that you can check that bucket, that's very good. But I would advise you, don't do it just for the sakes of trying to look good for a business school application. Do it because you're passionate about something. Because if you're passionate about something, you will do it, you'll do it well, and you'll commit to it. And that's what business schools really like.
Yeah, and there's kind of two quick points I'd make about outside activities. The first is that for every kind of investment banker or, someone who's working insane hours who says, you know what, I don't need activities, like this is, it's impossible with my job, I just get home and collapse, and the committee will understand, et cetera. I think that there's a fallacy in that for it seems like in every cycle, there are some of those investment bankers who not only are excelling at work, but manage to have some outside interests that they maintain and pursue with passion. And so you can't really rest on your laurels. And I think, yes, the committee understands like certain jobs have, different demands, but you got to be multidimensional. I think that's the biggest fear that an admissions officer has, is that, there's nothing more to you than the numbers on your transcript and kind of your work experience. They really want a kind of well-rounded class. And so they need candidates to have other passions. The other thing I would say is that volunteering's great. I think, again, we're 2 years plus out or so, if you're applying to business school and you're listening to this podcast, so you have time to get involved in something. But I would also say that it doesn't have to be, I feel like there's this stereotype out there which says that, you've got to do Habitat for Humanity or some kind of volunteer work in order to be a well-rounded MBA candidate. Like it's like a box you have to tick or something. And, I've seen many a candidate who has an outside interest that isn't necessarily just like a pure volunteer thing. It could be that you're a competitive cyclist on the weekends, riding in road races, or maybe you're a passionate photographer, or, maybe you are a DJ, or, there's many different things that people get into. And I think that's what the committee's looking for. They're looking for evidence that you're kind of like a regular human being with different interests. You're not just, a consultant who went to this school or something and has great grades. You're something more than that. And there is some background to this, right? They need kids who come to campus who are going to get involved in the clubs and the kind of campus life. And, if everyone was kind of one-dimensional, there probably wouldn't be many student clubs. So whatever it is, wine tasting, it doesn't have to be feeding the poor. So, and obviously, ideally, you're doing a little, more than one thing, right? But anyway, so I just want to make that point because I think that's something that people often, they get sort of stuck around, well, it has to be volunteering every Saturday at a soup kitchen or something.
Right. Or maybe you're a musician, you have a band, Graham, right?
Yes.
Yes. So Graham fell into that bucket and when he applied, and music was great. But also, actually, I recently worked on a piece that we produced for Stanford on AdCom Q&A. And when you talk about that sort of passionate cyclist and so forth, it's also that passionate cyclist that then goes ahead and organises an event in cycling or mentors new people coming into the pastime or something like that. That's the edge. That's the person that stepped forward within the passion that they pursue to do something a little bit more creative.
Right. And I was going to say, if you're, let's say you're a cyclist and you're kind of saying to yourself, well, I love going out every Saturday morning with my friends and we ride. It's not that much of a leap to then say, well, organize a formal ride that raises money for breast cancer or whatever it could be, right? Raise money for a cause, get other people involved because they want to ride to raise money too. That takes a kind of hobby and makes it into something with kind of leadership potential and all kinds of other things happening. And it also sends a signal to Stanford or whoever that, that you're, maybe you'll do something similar when you get to their campus. Maybe you'll organize a ride in Palo Alto or whatever it is, right? So yeah, just getting the most out of these outside activities and just pursuing them. And I think we hear time and time again candidates coming through the pipeline saying, well, I was active in college, haven't done much since, and it's too late to start now. But, again, if you're listening to this episode, you're applying a couple years from now, so you have time. And it's kind of, I would often say better late than never anyway, so get some things going if you haven't already.
Very good. So our next tip, Graham, I'll hand it over to you this time, is cultivating recommenders, even at this early stage, almost sort of for the long term. They are, in essence, going to be your mentors.
Yeah, so step 4 here, it would be really odd to go up to potential recommenders and say, will you write my business school recommendation letters yet, right? You're still a couple years out from application. But you should be thinking as you kind of navigate your way through the workplace and work your way up or move from project to project. You should be trying to identify who are the mentors in your organization that you've had a lot of contact with and who can speak very specifically about your skills and what you've done on different projects and so forth. So just building those relationships so that when you do have to ask them for a favor, it's not kind of awkward, that it just feels like that, you've been, attentive to their needs. They feel like paying you back the favor in some way, or you have this relationship where you're not going up to them and they're kind of like, what? I don't even remember the project we worked on 2 years ago. So cultivating these relationships because recommendation letters are important and it's important that you pick people who know you well. So it's not going to be enough to be, you might be saying, well, there's this woman in my company who I don't work with her, but she went to Kellogg and I'm going to apply to Kellogg. And so I know I'm going to ask her, when I apply to Kellogg. And that would be really foolish unless, we're 2 years out. Maybe you find a way to kind of get to know her and you start to do some project work with her or, volunteer work or whatever it might be within the workplace that, some outside, there are a lot of other things happening at work besides the main projects you're working on or something. So thinking just strategically about who you interact with at work, what your relationships are, and trying to say, gee, if I had to apply to business school now, who would those 2 or 3 individuals be that I might ask for letters?
I think you can't really understate the importance of this, but the one other side to this, though, Graham, is some of our candidates looking 2 years ahead, they're potentially in non-MBA friendly environments. So while they want to pursue an MBA, possibly tipping their hand at this early stage to potential recommenders might put their next 2 years in jeopardy. How would you advise those types of candidates?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think there are, a lot of workplace environments where, you wouldn't want to announce that you're heading off in a year or two to business school because, yeah, you'll just lose credibility. You become kind of a lame duck, and you might be first on the chopping block if they're making cuts. But I think that doesn't stop you from building strong relationships and kind of mentor type relationships with those senior to you, and just getting advice from them, because that's the relationship you want to establish. And whether or not you're talking to them about your plans to go to business school, that's up to you. But I think, at minimum, just getting advice, career advice, and having a relationship where you grab lunch with this person every so often is smart.
So our next tip is regarding your goals, mapping and determining your goals. One would assume if you're looking at an MBA 2 years from now, you have a reason for pursuing that MBA and some insight in terms of what you plan to do post MBA.
Yeah, one would hope that you're that you're going to go off to business school, to learn, but also that you have some end goal in mind. And I'm not suggesting, I don't think either of us would suggest that you need to know kind of exactly what you're going to do post MBA at this early stage, but it's something that schools do ask, whether in the application form or in an interview or sometimes via an essay. So thinking through like, gosh, right now I'm in consulting. I've been doing a lot of consulting in the pharma domain, and I want to go get an MBA, focusing on, operations and general management and strategy, so that I can then pivot into a kind of corporate role with a pharma. Maybe there's a leadership program within a pharma that I'd take, or, so thinking through like what would you want to do, and how might business school facilitate that is really important work to be doing. And, because once you know that, you can really, that helps with a lot of other things fall into place, whether it's, kind of school selection, geography. There are a lot of things that come into play. So yeah, just beginning to kind of think about what skills am I missing, what skills might an MBA give me, and what's my kind of short-term post-MBA plan and my long-term. So maybe in the scenario I just described, you might say, gosh, I really want to go work for like GlaxoSmithKline or I'm going to get or Johnson & Johnson, whoever it might be. And then after a period of time, I actually want to start my own medical devices company or something, right? So you want to get some entrepreneurial skill in business school as well. So yeah, just thinking through the steps, and yeah, getting ready to answer those types of questions would really be smart. It's also a great excuse to talk to people in industry, maybe people who have MBAs, and begin that kind of process of getting to know people who've done the degree and who've kind of followed a path that you're interested in following.
Yeah, and many of the candidates will be coming from industries like consulting, banking, where an MBA is almost the accepted path going forward. And you don't want to fall into the falsehood of, well, I've just got to get an MBA. That's the expected next step. You always want to go into this process with a set of goals in mind post MBA. Schools are not going to want to hear that you're applying simply because that's the expected next thing to do.
Right, right. And I think you're absolutely right. Like in banking and consulting in particular, there's this kind of herd mentality of like, well, you do a few years and then you go off to business school. And that, and one other tip we can give folks here is, when you think about what schools to apply to, you got to be very thoughtful as well. If a school, some of the programs out there are going to ask you, where else are you applying? Why are you applying to these schools? Again, it's not enough to say, well, these are the schools that everyone at my firm applies to, and everyone at my firm gets an MBA, and so here I am. That's going to kind of sink the ship right away. So really thinking carefully about what you would do. I know it can be difficult, and I'm not saying that everyone knows exactly what they want in life when they're 2 years away from applying to business school, but coming up with a kind of hypothetical plan that you can get behind and that feels like the most likely plan for you is a good idea. So yeah, really thinking that through. So that was tip number 5, kind of thinking about your goals and mapping out your goals. Tip number 6, Alex, we talked about keeping like a journal. And do you want to kind of get into that? Because I also think we should talk a little bit about the book that you've written, that Cleared Mitt published about getting into business school, and because there's a really good section in there that kind of relates to this journaling or coming up with stories. So why don't you speak to that?
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. This sort of idea of creating a journal that you can write down your experiences and the experiences that you may think become useful material for your stories in your MBA application essays, as well as content for your recommenders, or that you could suggest your recommenders address in the recommendation forms. So to the extent that as you're going through these experiences now and over the next 2 years, and when you're actually applying to business school, you don't really want to use anecdotes that are probably more than 2, 3, or 4 years old, because recency is quite a good thing. But so if you're looking 2 years in now, really writing down the most sort of compelling experiences that you're having, how you sort of feel and think, and various other things as you're going through those experiences, is going to be very helpful. Graham mentioned a book that we wrote for Clear Admit, sort of the definitive guide to MBA admissions. That's actually freely available on our website. So you can download that book. It's a very easy read, but it gives you sort of a lot of these insights, and focuses. One aspect it does focus on is this sort of inventory of experiences, collecting them, writing them down, identifying the different leadership attributes that each of the experiences highlights, and so forth. So I think that's a very important step. And again, if you're 2 years out, it's terrific that you can start doing this now than 2 or 3 months prior to applying.
Yeah, and I think Alex is being modest because he authored the book, but I would absolutely say grab it. I mean, you can get it on the site. It's free. You can grab the book and download it because it's got a lot of really good insights. It's this idea of keeping a journal, it really is helpful because not only will you need material for your essays and to sort of share with your recommenders, kind of jog their memory about projects that they worked on with you, but you also can use this material when you go to interview. I mean, there's just lots of opportunities to do so. And I think there are also a lot of essays out there that schools ask for that can be challenging. And so having like a little journal of like, oh, here are these 20 experiences that I've had either at work or in my extracurriculars or outside activities, that seeing, like, having this kind of roster of things to choose from that you can kind of drop in to an essay is really helpful. And in fact, I think a lot of the essays, I mean, I'm actually personally, I'm thinking of this essay that Stanford has historically asked about, what matters most to you and why, which, typically is an essay that really requires you to marshal some, different bring some different experiences to the fore that sort of suggest or support whatever it is you're saying matters to you. So having this inventory, like a journal that you keep, is a great idea. So yeah, just go grab yourself a notebook and have it with you, and just periodically try to write in it. It doesn't have to be an everyday type thing. It's just when something happens that's of note, get it down.
I guess a final point to this is if you're mapping all this stuff out now, 2 years ahead of applying to business school, you might even identify a weakness in your candidacy now, in terms of leadership experiences and so forth, that maybe you're on the weaker side, that you can then go ahead and pursue over the next 2 years to really further develop. So to the extent that you can do an inventory now, identify 1 or 2 weaknesses, pursue those weaknesses, just the process of doing all that is going to be very helpful for your application.
Yeah. So that was tip number 6. And our 7th and final tip, Alex, is about school selection, or kind of the initial research that you might do. And I know that a lot of you listening are like, wait, what do you mean? I already know I'm applying to, schools A, B, and C. But, at the end of the day, not everyone has their list settled. And there are things you can do. And even if you do know a couple of schools that you're going to apply to, there's still research you need to do. So do you want to just speak to that, Alex? Like why that would be the case?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of resources you can go to online to sort of identify a set of target schools. And the nice thing, again, about applying 2 years out is you've got time then to sort of change that target list a couple of times, add a school in, drop a school off, and so forth. So the obvious first place to look at business school rankings and try to identify where you fit as a candidate. Should you be applying for the very top schools, maybe a top 3 schools, top 7 schools, top 16, top 20, wherever you fit in that bucket. And then there are individual sort of websites like ClearAdmit. There's various others which I won't mention, but we're certainly not the only ones, where there are resources on those sites to help you get a better sense of which schools might make sense for us. Looking at Decision Wire tool might be useful when you can see where candidates are getting admitted, where they choose where to go, and so on and so forth, to get a sense of the types of schools. And then different schools offer various focuses. So if you want to do tech in Silicon Valley, obviously Berkeley has and Stanford are very good choices from a geographic standpoint, as well as obviously an overall branding and quality standpoint. And if you want to do something in the Northeast, in banking, your target schools may shift, and maybe Cornell becomes very important, Stern becomes very important, and so on and so forth. So understanding your goals will help shift your selection of target schools. Schools do a bunch of recruiting each season, so they'll host information events. You can go visit. They have campus visit programs and so forth. I think it's great to attend these events or visit campuses even this early in the process. You'll learn a lot. You may make some connections. Those connections may become worthwhile in the admissions process later down the line. So truly getting involved in the whole process now, I don't think can be a bad thing, Graham. Do you?
Right, I agree. I think, as I said earlier, with respect to the GMAT exam or the GRE, it's a lot to juggle when you're writing essays, managing your recommenders, getting test scores submitted, like dealing with all the odds and ends, transcripts from your undergraduate institution. And so to the extent that you can kind of get to some of these campuses or attend a session if a school comes to your city and kind of learn more about these programs, rather than having to do that in parallel to all the other things when admission season rolls around and you're actually applying, that would be great. I will say that Alex and I spoke about this just before we kind of jumped on the podcast. We were talking a little bit about how it at this early stage, it might be more of a kind of passive process, kind of doing a lot of listening and note taking, as opposed to, cornering an admissions officer and asking lots of questions that would suggest that you haven't done your homework yet, or that you don't, you may not know what your goals are. So I wouldn't try to get a lot of face time with the schools at this phase. I would use this to just listen, gather your information, and then, obviously you can visit these schools again or go to an info session when they're in your city or a fair when the time comes. But I think it's useful and can just be a nice way to kind of keep the MBA top of mind, keep your plan kind of top of mind as you travel, through this process.
The one addition I would say to this is, in terms of campus visits, you should be applying in the first round. I say that if you're thinking of the MBA 2 years out, you're going to be prepared. There's no disadvantage in applying in the first round, so you really should do that for the schools that you really want to attend anyway. And the disadvantage of applying into the first round for candidates generally is their campus visit programs aren't set at the beginning of the fall semesters. And generally, they wait 2 or 3 weeks before they really welcome and have a robust campus visit program available. So if you're applying 2 years out, you're applying in the first round, then make sure to have your visits complete the spring semester prior to the year that you're applying. I think that would be a good little bit of additional advice.
Yes, and for those kind of tuning in who are really just embarking on this process, what Alex is referring to is that, business schools have typically 3 or so rounds of admission for any given admission season. So they'll have a set of deadlines in like October, another set in January, and a final deadline in like March or April. And that's all people applying to start the following fall. They just do it in these kind of stages. And the first stage is the best place to be because there are the most slots available to candidates at that point. So Alex is recommending, apply in the first round. And given that, you've got to get to campus probably the spring prior if you're going to do campus visits for the reasons that he described. So yeah, there's a lot to think about. But I do want to encourage people, if you're listening to this and planning to apply to business school in a year or two, or even beyond, you're already like ahead of the curve and you should be patting yourself on the back. Just follow our steps here, get the tests out of the way, think about whether you need supplemental coursework. That was our first tip. Our second tip was, get the most out of your work experience, ask for challenging projects, take those international assignments or whatever comes your way. Our third tip was really develop that your kind of life outside of work, whether it's hosting a book club or a film discussion group or volunteering at a soup kitchen. Just get that part of your candidacy going if you haven't already. And the fourth tip was cultivating your recommenders or mentors, people that might be great potential recommendation letter writers down the road. Then we talked a little bit about tip number 6, which was tip number 5, which was mapping out your career goals. And then 6 was keeping a journal of interesting stories and things that might fit when it comes to, answering essay questions or giving your recommenders material and obviously going to interviews at schools. And then our final tip was just, start thinking about the schools you're going to apply to, get to their campuses, their info sessions, and be a kind of observer, note taker. Just get as much information as you can. Because some of those, that'll help shape the schools you apply to, but you might meet people. It may actually lead to connections that are useful in terms of, paving your way into a top school. So those are the 7 tips. Alex, anything else that you wanted to add?
No, I think that's great, Graham. I think hopefully people listening to this, they should get a good head start.
Yeah, and I really want to thank the folks, whoever it was on Reddit who kind of suggested this. And I'll say, we're open. This isn't, it won't exactly be like we're the band on stage and you call out a request and we'll play it. But obviously, if you have ideas, we're totally open and feel free to share them on our website, send us an email or just post in Reddit, wherever you want. Just let us know. We're always looking for new ideas. And we love having outside guests as well. So we've done a lot of good podcasts of late with some outside guests. So stay tuned. We got more great stuff in the works. And Alex, thanks so much for joining me as usual.
No, thank you very much for having me again.
All right, we'll see you soon. Thanks again, everybody.